By the time I made it to college in Ohio, I'd convinced myself that my cross-dressing thoughts were mere remnants of what I actually believed to be lesbian sex fantasies. After all, I loved girls and wanted to be a girl, hence, I was just another poor lesbian trapped in a man's body. So typical an answer in everyday man jokes. However, there was always a much darker secret behind my words that none other than Heather, my still Jewish girlfriend, really had any inkling of. Sex had since become quite confusing. I was even having trouble getting off for a while because it was always so hard to focus my thoughts. Unless I was in a position where I could at least imagine it being two girls, it just didn't seem to work. I absolutely hated being on top during sex, as the motions usually caused me to be a little more than uninterested in the matter. Also at this point, a lot of my close friends were beginning to joke at my expense, beyond usual male banter, about me being gay. I was told that I had homosexual tendencies on more occasions than I care to remember, and though there may have been a few times where my fantasies might have led me down that path, at that age, isn't a little personal curiosity normal? I guess people can sometimes just see things about a person that they themselves remain oblivious to. I won't deny that by the time I settled into my dorm, my deviant thoughts were once again running wild. Only at this point in my life, there pretty much weren't any mental boundaries that I wasn't crossing. I was a 20-year-old male. Could you expect any less? I'm actually very grateful for every minute I've ever spent in Ohio. It's still one of my favorite places in the country, thanks to the people there being so friendly. Everyone is so welcoming, warm, and kind. The whole state is like one big community. I don't know. Maybe it was all the LSD, but things really started to change for me there. The more my mind seemed to open up, the more I wanted to become the person I was constantly dreaming I was. But even on my off time, as in sober, I retained my deviant thoughts. I just didn't know how to verbally express them. That is, until the moment came that I almost physically acted upon my fantasies. It's of a memory that happened when I was at the Lake Erie beach just outside of Cleveland. It was late in the day and there weren't too many people around, and I'd just gone for a swim. When I came ashore, there was this guy standing there all by himself, watching me. We got to talking, and I got the impression that he was different. Maybe he sensed it in me too? So he and I started up a conversation, and it wasn't long before I sensed that I was being hit on. I can admit that I was tempted to push the issue just to see where it might lead, for until that moment, I never actually considered that I might be gay, and rather tell him, no, I'm not gay, as I believe most other guys would be inclined to say. I instead got his number and let him continue, and oddly enough, the only thought going through my mind was that he was probably out and comfortable with himself, and that I would actually be a step back for him, seeing as how I wasn't even out to myself yet. In the end, nothing ever happened between us, and I never followed through with calling him, but this chance encounter triggered a whole new thought process within me. Great. Not only was I dressing in women's clothing when no one was looking, as if the lesbian sex fantasies weren't enough, now I was going to start having gay fantasies as well. I've always been aware of my sexually open and explorative nature. That never bothered me. But now I had even more to think about and deal with. To everyone else, I was simply the fun-to-be-with guy who had a different girl every night and randomly suffered from the occasional gay tendency. But to me, I was so goddamn confused that it was just a matter of time before the shit hit the fan once more. Literally. No biggie, I was able to cope, for a little while longer. As the confusion set back in and my perfect world began to suffer from a sudden climate change, I naturally allowed my destructive ways to return, and in the wake of that recent upheaval, the school was about to suffer, and bad. See, One day out of the clear blue sky, a mad shitter emerged from within the school. People were finding his messes all over the place. It was truly the work of a madman. Mind you, it was still a garage setting throughout the school, less a few upstairs classrooms, if you can call them that. So it's not like the mad shitter was defecating on nice clean carpet. No, usually, this individual seemed to prefer striking in the bathroom, often crapping on the toilet seats, rather than in the toilet. And sometimes, the lone stranger would even find a nice healthy deuce in the floor, just next to the toilet. It was the strangest thing you ever saw, and to add to that, all of the toilets, for some reason, miraculously sprung leaks and got clogged, all at the same time. In fact, it got so bad that the health department threatened to shut the school down until it was fixed. There were daily floods which seeped into the hallway that no amount of mopping could fix. Now the reason this so-called mad shitter was labeled so was because every time there was one of his messes, there were at least 4 or 5 little smiley face stickers atop the pile to claim ownership, and at one point, someone happened to notice that the air freshener up next to the ceiling had been covered in said stickers, and when it was knocked off the wall, petrified turds were sent everywhere. I almost died laughing. It was a shit freshener. Don't get me wrong, I can explain. By mid-year, most people going to that institution were so fed up with the school's policies that things really started falling apart, for everyone. For instance, the vast majority there had signed up for the school's masters in auto mechanics, not diesel mechanics. However, what no one realized is they were selling our parents on the idea of Ohio Tech and talking us all into the master's program, which also covered diesel, that when we actually got there, the true curriculum consisted of something like 75% shitty diesel and only 25% auto. I'm not a big person. I like small engines, they're just easier to work on. And the idea of having to use a crane to lift the crankshaft out of the block never sat well with me. But there was no way out. Over half my time there was spent on diesel engines, which I thought was only going to be a small part of the experience. I didn't even touch a car till the very end. I was just a little pissed, and so were most of the other students. So once we all decided that things had reached their limit, it was pretty much all downhill. My goal was to instigate everyone into messing up whatever they could, breaking into the lunch lady's storage room, tipping over vending machines, chewing up food and throwing it at the walls. Oh, and putting sand in people's engines. That was always a classic. The entire school attitude seemed to get worse as the year went on, and it wasn't just me. Diesel and auto never really got along. Don't forget, this wasn't your typical college. It was just a dirty old shop cut into sections using broken down old rigs for walls, outlined by a few dozen cars. There were tools and grease everywhere, and the school uniform was a mechanic's jumpsuit which you had to wear at all times, kind of like the orange one I wore in jail, but in blue. So if you had a bunch of disgruntled students with sharp objects, things usually go south fairly quickly, and alas, they caught me on camera messing up the walls. I was immediately suspended, but before I left for the week, they also tried pinning the mad shitter incidents on me as well. Of course I denied it, so on my way out, I paid a good friend of mine to make a deposit back at the dorms and leave said stickers at the scene before reporting it. It was just as bad there, too. One thing always led to another, and the entire school was eventually in chaos. Someone even went and disconnected all the laundry room washing machine lines so that every time someone used one, it completely flooded the bottom apartments. It just goes to show that angry teenagers and tools do not mix. Also around this time, I blew out the clutch on my RX-7. However, instead of fixing it, I actually chose to dump the car. Well, it was more of a trade. I swapped it with one of the other delinquents for a Chevy Blazer. I could have fixed the clutch, but I just wasn't interested. That car was my life, and for some reason, I no longer cared. So I took my new Blazer, stood on the roof, and screwed a pair of computer speakers through the ceiling before covering every inch of the interior with the shooting star patterns cloth. When the engine ran low on oil, it got vegetable oil. And when I broke the rear window by accident, I made a new one out of duct tape and string. It was a mess all right, but it perfectly symbolized where things were going. I'd officially lost all interest not only in cars, but in everything. Weeks after my suspension, I still hadn't returned to class. I'd long since left the dorms and was now living with a classmate at his family's house. The only thing keeping me in Ohio was my job and the rave scene, which is a type of club with lots of drugs and techno music. This lasted for a few months until one night when I was driving back to my parents' house, I hit a dead deer in the road. I should have died, but I was speeding with no seatbelt and no insurance, all while listening to my music on a Discman through a pair of headphones. I should have known better, considering all the bloody skid marks painted on the road by those who crashed before me, but I was young and immortal. What did I care? As it turned out, I was the fourth person to hit that same dead buck. The person who nailed it before me flipped over and died. The cops were actually on their way to remove it when I crashed. They just needed to get a chain so they could tow it off the road because it was so big. However, after I splattered it, there was absolutely nothing left. It blew out both driver's side tires and sent me spinning. I first went into the left shoulder, kept spinning until I made my way back onto the highway, at which point I spun past and only narrowly missed the car behind me, before making my way into and off the right side shoulder, where I was finally brought to a halt after hitting a tree, causing said tree to then give way and fall over, namely onto the hood of my now destroyed car. By the time everything settled, I was in the passenger seat, still holding the steering wheel with one hand, and my headphones were now around my neck. My Discman had been thrown against the windshield and was shattered on impact. When I came to my senses and exited the wreck, standing before me was some random kid. I was so confused and dizzy. He tried telling me that I almost hit their car as I spun past, and then he offered me a ride to the nearest gas station. And when I got into their car, there was blood spatter on his windshield. It was pretty freaking scary. I never returned to Ohio after that and simply moved back in with my parents, where I eventually got a job working with my mom in a warehouse, pulling orders for delivery while driving a high-low forklift. I never worked on cars again, at least not professionally. I somehow made it out of that mess alive, but don't ask me how. Shortly after, Heather and I officially ended it, and I moved on to the next chapter in my life. Getting rid of my RX-7 was the last straw, as that car was what had gotten me into the industry, and was pretty much all that was holding me together.